Welcome everyone to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Public Programs Director of YIVO. And we're really pleased to welcome you here today for this talk, Yiddish and Zionism with Rachel Rojanski. So for those that don't know YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and cultivation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and a library of over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which researchers from around the world use for their work. In addition to making this material available, we have a variety of classes, exhibitions, and public programs like this one that bring it to life. So right now we're in the midst of our Yiddish language program, which we have students from all over the world studying Yiddish with us in a very intensive program, of which David Brown is the academic director. And this is a part of the Yiddish Civilization lecture series, which is a series of lectures that are both meant for our students and also meant for the wider public to kind of get a part of the fun of the Yiddish summer program. So thank you again for joining us. We're really pleased to have Rachel Rojanski with us today. Rachel Rojanski is Associate Professor of Judaic Studies at Brown University, and she recently published Yiddish in Israel, A History with Indiana University Press, excuse me. And we did a wonderful panel discussion about this when the book came out, so you can check that out on our YouTube channel. I think that we're all really in for a treat. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. So I'll share my screen now.
Great.
Okay, it doesn't work. You have to wait a little. אדם, השאר סקרין לא עובד, בוא מהר. זה עבד קודם וזה לא עובד עכשיו. כן.
So everyone just bear with us. We're having some technical difficulties. Hopefully we'll get this up momentarily. Rachel, if you can't get it to work, feel free to send me the file and I can share it on my end. Again, our apologies for the technical difficulties. We did do a test just now, but sometimes technology doesn't behave.
Okay, sorry about this. Alex, can you hear me?
Yes, and no problem.
Okay, I'm starting.
Yes, looks great now.
Can
Thank you very
me?
much.
Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Alex?
Yes, we can see.
Alex, can you see the share screen?
Yes, I can see the share screen.
Okay, אני מתחילה. On February 1st, 1945, during the 6th convention of the Histadrut, Rushka Korczak, a heroine of the Vilna ghetto and the partisans, stepped up to the podium to report on the extent of the massacres in the Vilna ghetto. Korczak, who had arrived to Israel only 2 months earlier, spoke in Yiddish because she didn't know Hebrew. The next speaker was David Ben-Gurion, and he began, quote, although the Havera who preceded me spoke in foreign grating language, an uproar broke out in the hall, and he got no further. Even though he never repeated these words, it was enough to seal his image as the enemy of Yiddish, the man who not only shaped the Israeli public negative opinion of Yiddish, but also persecuted Yiddish culture in Israel's early years. Ben-Gurion's comments was also perceived as a direct continuation of the Zionist movement's traditional attitude to Yiddish and the Jewish diaspora in general. But was the Zionist movement really so implacably hostile to Yiddish? In my talk today, I'll present briefly the tension between the ideological attitude of Zionism to Yiddish and its practical approach to Yiddish language and culture. I will begin by surveying the situation in the diaspora before the Holocaust and then elaborate on pre-state Palestine and the state of Israel. I will argue that the most vehement ideological manifestation of opposition to Yiddish took place in pre-state Palestine. In both the diaspora and the state of Israel, the attitude to Yiddish was much more complex. Hebrew was the crowning jewel of Zionism, and although the Basel program did not discuss it, it was self-evident that Hebrew would be the language of the future state, a Jewish state. Presenting the Jews as a Hebrew nation and had more than linguistic significance, it was a political manifestation, and that the Jews were a nation like all other. But this brought Yiddish into the equation, with others wanting to assign the same role to Yiddish rather than to Hebrew. This development had an impact all over the Jewish diaspora. In the Pale of Settlement, small group of arbiter Zionist and Zionist workers emerged that promoted Hebrew at the expense of Yiddish, which according to the 1897 census was the first language of 98% of the Jews. The aftermath of the Russian Revolution saw the emergence of the new Palestinian parties, first in the US in 1905, then in Russia, Galicia, and finally in Eretz Israel in 1906. With the exception of Eretz Israel, or the Eretz Israel party, these were all Yiddish speaking. Though all three agreed that Hebrew would be the language of Eretz Israel, they envisioned a long period in the diaspora before settlement there would be possible. Ber Borochov, the leader of the Russian Palestine, saw a key role for Yiddish in consolidating the Jewish nationalism in the diaspora. Palestine of America added this explicitly to their platform and played a pivotal role in developing Yiddish education and the Yiddish Press in America and later in Israel too. However, when the World Confederation of Palestine was created in 1907, it refused to discuss the language issue. The 1908 famous Sprachkonferenz took place in Chernowitz. Among the delegates were many Zionists. The famous resolution that Yiddish is a national language, as a national language of the Jewish people, was in fact drafted by Leon Chazanovich, a leading labor Zionist. In interwar Poland, the Zionist movement emphasized Hagshama, which is the fulfillment of the Zionist idea, by physically settling in Israel. and Hebrew education, particularly in the Tarbut school system. In addition, the youth movement and the Hachshara camps that prepare young people for life in pre-state Palestine will run in Hebrew. Still, the vast majority of the Polish Jews did not know Hebrew. As early as 1905, they were reading 5 Yiddish dailies, some with Zionist orientation, boasting a daily distribution of 96,000, and only 3 Hebrew dailies with a daily distribution of 12,000. If Zionism wanted to reach the broader Jewish population, it had to use Yiddish. This was typical for Zionism, and especially to labor Zionist group across the Jewish diaspora. Vehement, sometimes violent opposition to Yiddish developed in the issue, though news of it soon spread throughout the Jewish world. Beginning during the second Aliyah, which is 1904 to 1914, the leaders of Poalei Zion movement in Eretz Israel, who later became the heads of the Yishuv and the head of the State of Israel, promoted strong opposition to Yiddish, considering the revival of Eretz Israel their most sublime ideal, and the revival of Hebrew an integral part of that. They made the issue of language a top priority. Though they targeted a range of languages, opposition to Yiddish took center stage. Based on the widespread image of Yiddish as anti-Zionist, their opposition also stemmed from practical consideration. The language's growing power in the diaspora in those years led to a fear that a large wave of immigration of Yiddish speakers would prevent the revival of Hebrew in the Yishuv. Strong public opposition to the use of Yiddish was encouraged. Things could even get physical. During Chaim Zhitlovsky's visit to Israel in 1914, he was physically stopped from giving a lecture in Yiddish. In reality, Yiddish posed no threat to Hebrew at that time. The number of Yiddish newspapers that circulated there was very small, and with the exception of the left Poalei Zion Neue Welt, which ran from 1934 to 1955, they were very short-lived. Nonetheless, in 1923, an organization called Gdud Meginei HaSafa, Defender of Hebrew Language Battalion, was founded. Composed mainly of high school students, it engaged in teaching Hebrew, putting out pro-Hebrew propaganda, and participating in public activism against the use of other languages, especially Yiddish. This small group had a very loud voice, which allowed it to influence public opinion way beyond its actual power. In 1927, significant public debate broke out over the proposal to establish a chair in Yiddish at the Hebrew University to be endowed by the owner of the New York daily, Der Tog. The idea raised enormous controversy. Zionist leaders wrote to the university's president, warning him that the Yiddish chair would destroy the whole institution. The Gdud Meginei HaSafa described the Yiddish chair as a crucifix in the sanctuary. The project came to nothing. Now, here in the photos, you can see the Gdud Meginei HaSafa. They don't look high school students, but this is how they dressed in those days, and they were so. They look a little older. They have this sign, Ivri Daber Ivrit, Hebrew name, speak Hebrew. This is another poster against the Yiddish chair at the Hebrew University, which means the chair in jargon is the end or the destruction of the Hebrew University. By the late 1930s and 1940s, the general public in pre-state Palestine had lost interest in the question of Yiddish, and it stopped being an issue. Nonetheless, the image of the Israeli leadership as zealous opponents of Yiddish became fixed in the public memory. This was the situation when the State of Israel was founded, giving the Zionist leadership the tools to finally eradicate the linguistic enemy. However, I would argue that this was not the reality that emerged. Not surprisingly, things developed in much more complex and nuanced way. My research has shown that while Israel under Ben-Gurion did reject Yiddish to some extent, it also took steps to ensure its survival and even make it part of Israeli culture. The history of Yiddish in Israel and attitudes toward it there had been treated impressionistically for decades. Statements like the Ashkenazi establishment spurned the language and culture of the Jews of Eastern Europe for ideological reasons are still given as the definite explanation for the fate of Yiddish in the state of Israel, even in the third decade of the 21st century. I would like to challenge this view. Based on detailed archival research, my study not only paints a picture of Yiddish culture enjoying vibrant growth in the state in Israel's first decade, but actually presents Yiddish as an integral part of Israel's new culture. It does so by examining the development of Yiddish language culture in Israel and charting the dialectical tension and reciprocal influence of its interaction with Israeli Hebrew culture. The background for this is the unique situation of language in the nascent state of Israel. Mass immigration to Israel after 1948 meant that the immigrant population soon outnumbered those already settled. This unprecedented situation not only created difficulties in terms of housing and jobs, it also brought with it a great number of different languages, Jewish and non-Jewish. Teaching Hebrew, the language of the country, and ensuring that new immigrants could use it became then an urgent political need. But it was much more than that. Hebrew was integral to Zionist ideology. So the Israeli authorities looked for creative ways to teach it and make it the language of the new immigrants. This included restricting the use of non-Hebrew Jewish languages. Among those, Yiddish had a unique status. Since many of the Israeli leaders came from Eastern Europe, they were aware that Yiddish had been the strongest Jewish language before the Holocaust, and some did see it as a potential obstacle for the inculcation of Hebrew. But at the same time, many had a soft spot for Yiddish and even loved it. The need to negotiate between practical and ideological consideration on the one hand, and an emotional attachment on the other, led to the development of a dialectic attitude. At one pole, then was the ideology of negating the diaspora that underpinned Israel's Zionism, held that Jewish life in the diaspora was flawed in its entirety, politically, economically, and socially. As a result, Jews should not only leave the diaspora and go to their own land, but should also expunge the diaspora from their historical consciousness altogether. Jewish historical memory, according to this view, must draw a direct line from the time of the Second Temple to the State of Israel, ignoring the 2,000 years of diaspora life. Yiddish, the ultimate symbol of diaspora, was thus rejected by those who adhere to this ideology. At the other pole of the dialectic was the personal attitude of the leaders to Yiddish. This then raises two questions. One, was there in fact a clearly defined official policy toward Yiddish in Israel? And two, what were the most important factors shaping the development of Yiddish in Israel? Were these the actions of the state, or did other things come into play? I will answer this by examining two major realms of Yiddish culture in early Israel. First, the Yiddish Press, traditionally the most important arena of the development of modern Yiddish culture, and here also the main arena for the conflict between Yiddish speakers and the state. Then I'll turn to Yiddish Theater, another mainstay of Yiddish culture, and show how the tension between the trans-regional nature of Yiddish and the local nature of Israeli Hebrew culture influenced the development of Yiddish theater in Israel. I will start with the press. In pre-state Israel, there had been almost no Yiddish press. However, within less than a year after the proclamation of the state, There were already several dozen Yiddish periodicals in circulation, including newspapers, political periodicals, and literary journals. A decade later, the Yiddish Press in Israel boasted 61 regular publications, some issued by public bodies or political parties. This is clearly not a story of a persecuted and stifled culture. How had it come about? As in Eastern Europe and in the US, Israel's early Yiddish newspapers were privately owned, and the hero of our story here is Mordechai Tsanin, the founder and editor of Israel's leading newspapers. Born in Poland in 1906, Tsanin embarked on a modest career as a Yiddish writer in the 1930s before fleeing Poland after the Nazi occupation and finally reaching Tel Aviv in 1941. In July 1948, Tsanin decided to start a Yiddish weekly, clearly understanding the cultural importance of such publication for the mass of Yiddish-speaking immigrants soon to come from Eastern Europe. He chose the format of a photo magazine with little accompanied text and gave it a brilliant bilingual name, Illustrator Wochenblatt and Shavuon Metzuyer, both which mean illustrated weekly. The new weekly fulfilled the traditional role of immigrant press, but also dealt with the current Israeli reality of the war of independence and the post-Holocaust situation, treating them both as two sides of the same coin. The image of the strong, brave Israeli soldier it peddled was very much in line with the Zionist ethos, but he was also presented as the survivor, moving from the diaspora past into the Israeli present naturally and seamlessly, a stark contrast to the Zionist negation of the diaspora. You can see here in the photo the covers, several covers of Illustrator Wochenblatt. The right wing, you can see a soldier, an Israeli soldier holding a Sefer Torah and also holding some old Jews. And the writing in Yiddish, it's also in Hebrew, but in Hebrew it's only short. The writing in Yiddish says, it's very difficult to see it on the screen, Der Sellner von Zwaganal Israel zerreißt die Ketten von sein versklavt Volk und versichert die Unabhängigkeit von sein Land und die Freiheit von sein Volk. Which means the soldier from the IDF tears the chains of his enslaved people and ensures the independence of his country and the freedom of his people, which is a kind of connection between the diaspora and the state of Israel, which wasn't welcomed by the thinking of the Hebrew Israeli culture. In October 14, 1949, Illustrator Wochenblatt announced a number of changes, including a new name, Letzte, the latest news. Though it implied that the change would be merely cosmetic, Letzte soon proved to be quite a different entity and succeeded not only in transforming the Yiddish press in Israel, but also in leaving a mark on the Hebrew press too. The new publication was shaped as an immigrant newspaper that would engage in domestic politics while helping immigrants put down roots in the new country. It continued the tradition of the pre-war Yiddish press in Eastern Europe, forming part of the trans-regional Yiddish culture, while at the same time focusing on the new realities of the Israeli life. Since those were very different from the reality in which the Yiddish press had developed in other countries, Letzte quickly became a new type of newspaper. No longer a paper of a minority group, it soon became part of the country's political life and influenced it in ways that no previous Yiddish newspaper had ever succeeded in the past. Yet the great enthusiasm with which Letzte started out soon faded as the paper began to struggle for survival. For the rest of their lives, Tsanin and many other Yiddish journalists would claim that this was a result of conscious governmental discrimination. The reality, however, was much more complex. The basic legal document that regulated the press in the state of Israel and defined its relation with the authorities was the Press Ordinance of 1933, formulated by the British Mandatory Authority and adopted by the State of Israel. It stated that no paper may be printed in or published in Palestine unless it first obtained a license signed by the responsible district official. The press ordinance established basic criteria for those able to receive a license to publish a newspaper, but also left considerable discretion in the hand of the responsible officials who in the State of Israel served in the Ministry of Interior. As early as May 1949, the Press, Information and Film Administration in the Ministry of Interior decided to prohibit the publication of non-Hebrew dailies. This was less an ideological decision than a result of a severe shortage of newsprint and the consequent pressure of major Hebrew dailies who wanted to monopolize it. Of course, as part of their campaign, they didn't hesitate to give dire warning of the danger of Yiddish. In 1952, the newly founded Supreme Council of Cultural Affairs, headed by the Minister of Education, Professor Ben-Zion Dinur, and charged with finding ways of making Hebrew the main language of the entire Israeli Jewish population, learned that there were 91 non-Hebrew periodicals in circulation. It therefore made two recommendations. First, that the government not ban, but control the licensing of non-Hebrew papers for Jewish readers by limiting their publication to 3 times a week. And second, that low priority should be given in allocating them newsprint. Now you can see Ben-Zion Dinur, and this is the poster of the council announcing the language trustees, which are people who would volunteer to teach Hebrew. That was the legal and political reality that Let's Tenayes had to face. Let's Tenayes appeared as a weekly for 17 weeks, and then, following the granting of a new license in February 1950, published bi-weekly. Within a couple of months, Tsanin filed a request to publish Let's Tenayes 3 times a week. He was refused, with no explanation, and in response, applied to make Let's Tenayes a daily. The answer he got from the Ministry of the Interior was that, quote, the foreign language press, including Yiddish, could not be allowed to expand, and that due to the lack of paper, his request would not be granted. In 1952, there was a massive increase in Israel paper stocks, and Tsanin tried again to turn Let's Tenayes into a daily. Though he was turned down again, he didn't give up on the plan. Instead, following a time-honored strategy, he decided to publish another newspaper, Yiddish Zeitung. You can see here Yiddish Zeitung and Let's Tenayes on the same page. He decided to publish another newspaper, Let's Tenayes, Yiddish Zeitung, that was also appear 3 times a week on the days Let's Tenayes did not, which means Let's Tenayes appeared on Sunday, Tuesday, and Friday. It was the flagship paper, and Yiddish Zeitung appeared on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Together, the two would form a daily paper. The two papers made no secret of the fact that they were working around the licensing regulation. In fact, the front page of both declared proudly that Let's Tenayes and Yiddish Zeitung were one and the same. You can see also here that it says Leyend morgen, read tomorrow in Let's Tenayes, and it has the same logo. In terms of structure, context, and design, Let's Tenayes was like any other Israeli Hebrew daily, even when it came out only 2 or 3 times a week. It contained political and financial news, articles on current affairs, editorial, and also top-class art and literature sections. But it also had some qualities of its own that set it apart from the Hebrew newspaper. In fact, it quickly became the voice of the Yiddish-speaking Holocaust survivors within Israeli societies and acted, among other things, to preserve the memory of the Jews in Eastern Europe and make it part of the Israeli culture. It also took a very oppositional approach to the government and especially to Mapai and Ben-Gurion. Though the Minister of Interior and government minister and Knesset members were all very well aware that Let's Tenayos was doing an end run and around the refusal to license it by appearing as two papers that came out 3 times a week, they did nothing about it. The greatest opposition to the Yiddish Press was expressed by the editors of the major Hebrew daily. With a distribution of 30,000 copies a day, they saw Let's Tenayos as serious competition. So while the government was trying to instill Hebrew with cultural tools, such as expanding Hebrew teaching and issuing propaganda against non-Hebrew languages, it was the editors of the Hebrew dailies that were aggressively seeking enforceable legislation. Yiddish speakers, writers, and activists reacted with fury. The politicians, however, uninterested in putting further restrictions on Yiddish, did nothing, and not without good reason. On the one of the 100 or so of Yiddish newspapers and periodicals created in Israel during the 1950s, only a few, most important among them, Let's Tenayos, were privately owned. In those years, the overwhelming majority were published by public organizations and institutions such as the Histadrut, or by political parties interested in reaching the Yiddish readers among the new immigrants. Of course, to attract the audience and to hold its attention, these party papers had to be high quality, providing a range of content, including literary and cultural material. They also used the same tactics of publishing one paper under 2 names to circumvent the ban on non-Hebrew dailies. Thus, in paradoxical fashion, many of the same forces in Israel that were opposed to Yiddish in principle actually contributed to the development of vibrant Yiddish press. Mapai, the hegemonic Labor Party run by Ben-Gurion, invested a great deal in effort in creating its own Yiddish paper as a way to confront Tzannin anti-Mapai writing. This culminated in 1960 in a decision to buy Let's Tenayos and continue publishing it itself, though it was more than partly motivated by a desire to muzzle Tzannin. He remained editor as part of the deal. So it was Mapai under Ben-Gurion that became the publisher of Israel's most important Yiddish paper. In fact, this was not the only Yiddish project it supported, an issue I'll return to in my conclusion. Now you can see here, Das Wort is the Yiddish version of Davar, or Der Wach al HaMishmar, Israel Stimme of Mapam. Unser Heind, Unser Freund are the 2 papers of the general Zionist party, which came out 3 times a week. Das Wort and Oif Der Wach didn't have enough money to publish so many times a week. But this was a quintessential example, Unser Heind, Unser Freund, how a political party, which was the second in power in Israel in those days, did the same trick to circumvent the restriction and publish a Yiddish daily. The Yiddish Theater, like the Yiddish Press, played an important role in all the East European Jewish immigrant societies. However, while the press created a unique kind of Israeli newspapers that combined traditional Yiddish press with the new Israeli press, Yiddish Theater maintained its trans-regional nation for a long time. Based on the existing body of Yiddish drama, and sometimes even on actors and companies that travel from place to place, the theater actually brought East European Jewish culture to the new post-Holocaust Jewish center. This, of course, brought it into direct conflict with Israel's culture policy. However, as with the press, the attitude of the Israeli authorities to the Yiddish theater was driven not just by ideology, but also by cultural and political interests, as well as personal feelings. In addition, the general public, both Hebrew and Yiddish speaking, had a much more important role to play here. Yiddish theatrical performances in Israel started with a wave of immigration from Poland in 1950 and brought many Yiddish actors who survived the Holocaust. 1948 Israel enacted no official rules or laws in regard of non-Hebrew Jewish theater. Nonetheless, the legal means was found to limit its development. It was the Council for the Control of Films and Plays, based on in the Ministry of Interior. The Council drew on the Public Theater Ordinance of 1927 and its amendment in 1937 of the Mandatory Palestine. According to this law, anyone wishing to stage play needed a permit from the Council that had no official guidelines governing its activity, which gave it a lot of leeway. There was no legislation dealing directly with Yiddish, but in August 1949, the Council, as part of a more general declaration of principle, announced the following limitations on Yiddish theater. 1, general performances in Yiddish were to be banned. 2, foreign troops that came to Israel for a short visit could hold stage shows for only 6 weeks. And 3, Yiddish theater shows would be permitted inside new immigrant transit camp, but only for a short period. These restrictions had a few teeth. A performance could not be stopped once it began, even if it had no permit, though the actors could be and were brought to court and fined, usually a small sum. The companies soon found workarounds. A common trick was to give the wrong starting time in the ads. The audience knew to come early, so by the time the police showed up, the show was already running and could not be stopped. Some Yiddish actors were brought to court after the fact, where they were sentenced to a fine of £1 Israeli pound. Just for comparison, the license fee was £0.50. So if somebody applies for a license and doesn't get it, he loses £0.50. If he decides to perform and get fined, he will still make more money. The first Yiddish Bible repertory theater in Israel was the Goldfaden Theater. Founded by 3 acclaimed Yiddish actors, Natan Wolfowitz, David Hart, and Israel Segal, and based in a Yiddish-speaking immigrant neighborhood in Jaffa, it opened in December 1950. The application for a license to perform in Yiddish was denied, but they began performing anyway. As a result, they were fined and even summoned to police stations. They didn't take it lying down. In late June 1951, they petitioned the Supreme Court in its capacity as High Court of Justice, citing the Minister of Interior, the Council for the Control of Films and Plays, the National Headquarters of Israel Police, the Central Investigation Department, and the Police Commander of Tel Aviv District. This move generated an immediate discussion on Yiddish theater in Israeli cabinet, where most of the participants opposed restricting Yiddish theater. Ben-Gurion agreed, stating explicitly and with emphasis that Yiddish theater was to be permitted in the state of Israel. From July 1951, then, Yiddish theater could perform in Israel with no obstruction. Ironically, however, despite the stunning legal victory, the Goldfaden Company had to close anyway because audience did not come. Located in a Yiddish-speaking neighborhood, the theater had attracted Yiddish-speaking locals. They were not interested in the play or in acting. All they wanted, as one critic wrote, was to close their eyes and imagine they were back in the old country. This was simply not enough to maintain a stable theater. The lifting of the ban of Yiddish theater did lead to a rapid growth of a number of Yiddish shows. Most of them, however, were put on by visiting actors or companies specializing in light entertainment and traveling between Israel and Latin America. They would come for a few months in the winter and stage operettas and melodramas with songs, dance, and simple romantic or tragic plot. In Yiddish culture, this was regarded as low-class shund. But unlike the repertory theater, many shows enjoyed box office success. In 1962, there was another attempt to create a repertory company in Yiddish. Annie Litton, a well-known Yiddish actress from Chile, came to Israel and started an art house Yiddish theater. Her cast included the finest actors, and they received rave reviews in the Hebrew press. The audience, however, voted with its feet. So in 1965, Litton left the country. An active and vibrant Yiddish theatrical scene did develop in Israel throughout the 1950s and 60s. It was characterized by the traditional tension between a great deal of low-level popular entertainment and a small number of high-quality theatrical productions. However, in Israel, it was not only Yiddish art theater that failed to take off. Even the popular sector was not able to put down stable roots. Since the formal restriction on Yiddish theater had been lifted in 1951, they cannot have been the cause. To find that, we need to look elsewhere. As the vast majority of Yiddish theater provided low-level entertainment, it soon acquired a negative image. The Hebrew press called it theater whose artistic value is nil. Letzte and Lebensfragen, both major Yiddish periodicals, even urge the readers to stay away. In fact, not only did the authority not interfere in the Yiddish theater arena, they actually provided another option for Yiddish theater goers, though the goal was not so much supporting Yiddish theater as using its trans-regional nature for the benefit of the Jewish nation state. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, some of the great actors of the international Yiddish stage played an important role in the Israeli Yiddish theatrical world. For the guest artist, visiting Israel was a genuinely emotional experience. However, it was also an important professional move. The significant decline of Yiddish theater in both post-Holocaust Europe and the US was forcing Yiddish actors to seek out new audiences. Many traveled to Latin America to perform, but after the large-scale immigration of survivors from Europe, Israel actually became the preferred destination. In fact, it became the largest and most diverse arena for Yiddish theater worldwide. The audience that the foreign stars attracted included not only new immigrants, but also perhaps especially Yiddish-speaking old-timers, intellectuals, public figures, journalists, writers, whose primary interest was to see a great actor or one of the classic Jewish plays, not necessarily Yiddish theater as such. The public figures, journalists, high officials, and even Israeli authorities were pleased with these visits as they helped strengthen Israel's status as a highly desirable venue for successful Jews, especially those with great reputation, as just helped strengthen Israel's position as a cultural center of the entire Jewish people. Some of these visitors, actors like Maurice Schwartz, Yosef Bulov, and Ida Kaminska, were even invited, each in a different way, to settle in Israel and start their own company. Their stories, thus, are important for understanding the Israeli leadership complex and multifaceted approach to Yiddish theater and Yiddish culture in general. Both Maurice Schwartz and Yosef Bulov came to Israel several times in the 1950s. Schwartz was the best known representative of the Yiddish theater worldwide. Bulov was the embodiment of the Yiddish actor from Vilna who made it on Broadway and in Hollywood. They were both welcomed with great enthusiasm by political figures, including the Minister of Education, as well as by journalists and critics. Both also tried to start a Yiddish art theater in Israel, but Schwartz passed away during his visit to Israel in May 1960, and Bulov's plan did not materialize either. If Schwartz and Bulow represented the Israeli, to the Israelis, the Yiddish Theater of America and the New World, the third international star to visit, Ida Kaminska, symbolized the Yiddish artistic theater of Eastern Europe and the old world in general. The daughter of Esther Rochel Kaminska, the legendary Yiddish actress, known as the mother of Yiddish theater and the founder of Jewish art theater in pre-World War Warsaw, Ida Kaminska ran the state Yiddish theater in Poland during the 1950s. Little surprised then that the Israeli journalist described her as representing the old kingdom of Israel that doesn't exist anymore. Kaminska visited Israel twice during the late 50s, and her performances too were received very warmly. However, unlike the visits of the other two, official Israeli agencies were involved in organizing her tours here. The press was set up with the help of the Israeli embassy in London, following her company's run in 1957. In fact, the ambassador himself discussed with Foreign Minister then Golda Meir the possibility of bringing Kaminska to Israel to set up a Yiddish theater there with the goal of bringing, quote, culture and art in Yiddish from the state of Israel to those Jewish centers for which Yiddish is still a precious language, which means that the Yiddish theater that Ida Kaminska was supposed to found was expected to go on tours to the entire Jewish world to come from Israel, which would make Israel the center of Yiddish theater. To conclude, the starting point of any discussion of the development of Yiddish in Israel, the country that was the living embodiment of the Zionist idea, must be that Israeli authorities invested huge effort in creating a new Israeli Hebrew culture, encompassing every possible realm of life. Their goal was to make Jewish immigrants with different traditions, cultures, values, and languages into a new single people. One way to do this was to impose restrictions of various kinds on the non-Hebrew languages and culture. And when it came to Yiddish, always viewed as the greatest threat to Hebrew, these were seriously considered. However, they were never a real option. The Israeli government did not use legislation, but hegemonic cultural tools to achieve their goals. However, as we saw in our discussion of the press, when it came to Yiddish, things were more complex. When forced to choose between Hebrew cultural hegemony and their own political needs, the Israeli authorities preferred the latter. They were thus quite willing to exploit Yiddish and even encourage its development in order to strengthen their political position among the new immigrants. A similar situation can be seen in the tension that grew up between Hebrew as a local culture and Yiddish as a trans-regional culture. As we saw in the case of Yiddish theater, though Ben-Gurion and the Israeli leadership were preoccupied with strengthening this new Israeli Hebrew culture, they also invested a great deal of thought in establishing Israel as a cultural center of world Jewry. Here, Yiddish, the quintessential trans-regional Jewish culture, had a key role to play. Incidentally, this is also why the Histadrut brought the eminent poet Avrom Sutzkever to Israel in 1947 and created for him the Golden Decade, a Yiddish literary quarterly that actually made Israel the world center for Yiddish literature in the 1960s. Of course, it was not ideology and political interests of various kinds that were at play here. Israeli leaders were in negotiation between their ideology and their emotion, and as far as Yiddish was concerned, emotion were a force to be reckoned with. Where then did the idea that Yiddish was persecuted in Zionist Israel come from? Yiddish speakers, writers, and actors who came to Israel after the Holocaust were a sui generis kind of immigrants. Israeli sociologists have called their experience immigrating home. In truth, they did not expect Yiddish to become the language of Israel and didn't even teach it to the children. All they wanted was respect to their cultural heritage, respect and compassion. But times were harsh and Israel had none to spare. For this, the Yiddish-speaking establishment never forgave them. In the end, Yiddish developed in Israel along with immigrant society as part of the Israeli culture. As time went on, people moved to Hebrew and abandoned much of the Yiddish culture. In 1961, Eichmann trial and the brief wave of nostalgia in the mid-60s did support a momentary revival of Yiddish, but the real comeback of Yiddish theater and Yiddish culture in general belongs to the cultural setting of the late 20th century. Then it involved question of the politics of identity, nostalgia, and creating a usable past. That, however, is a subject for another talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We've got a ton of questions, and hopefully we'll get to many of them. And if you have questions, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to it. So let's dive in. So one question I think will take us way back, just to give some extra context for some of the viewers that, that know a little bit less about the background. But could you maybe speak for just a moment about how Hebrew came to be the language of the Zionist movement, despite the fact that most of the Zionist movement were native Yiddish speakers?
Well, Yiddish is the ancient Jewish language. It's the language of the prayers. It's the language of the Bible.
Hebrew, sorry, you
Hebrew,
said Yiddish.
I'm sorry. Okay.
It's a Freudian slip.
No, I'm influenced by Ivo. Yes, Yiddish is the ancient Jewish language. It's the language of the Bible. It's the language of the Jewish prayers. And it was some kind of natural move if we go back to the land of our forefathers, which so we will use the language of this country, of this land. This was a kind of natural thing that Hebrew and Zionism go together. The land of Israel and Hebrew go together. And actually, nowadays there are there is a growing number of scholarship that actually show that during the pre-state period, which means during the second Aliyah and then during the mandate, many other languages were in use. During the mandate, many spoke English, but other languages were in use, and immigrants from all kinds of countries were speaking many languages. And Yiddish was also spoken, but the official language, when the Yishuv started to organize, and Polizion of Eretz Israel, and with the leadership of Ben Gurion and then Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, who was the second president of the State of Israel, Hebrew became a main goal. And actually, in 1921, Polizion in Israel was created in October 1906 in Chol HaMoed Sukkot. And they are the only Polizion party that had their platform in Hebrew. And they, of course, promoted Hebrew. And I'll tell you as a secret that no one hears, then their first publication was, they had a newspaper that was called Hatchala, and surprise, surprise, they also had some volumes that were called Onfang. So I'm telling it very quietly so nobody would hear this secret. But seriously, in 1921, this party, Polizion, merged with another party, which is called, with the funny name, Mifleget Habilti Miflagteim, the non-partisan party, headed by Berl Katzenelson, and they created Achdut HaAvoda. And Achdut HaAvoda, and then the Histadrut, they passed a rule that people, in order to get a job, should demonstrate a certain knowledge of Hebrew. So this is actually, on the one hand, there is the entire Jewish diaspora. I need to add also that before the Holocaust, there were approximately 16.5 million Jews worldwide. 66% of them were Yiddish speakers to some extent. So Yiddish actually was the lingua franca of the Jews. And they actually started fighting it.
So there are a lot of questions about the other languages that Jews spoke. Obviously, this is a bit of a different topic, but maybe you can give us some of the context of the way that the kind of restrictions that were placed on Yiddish. What was going on in Judeo-Arabic, with Ladino, with other Jewish languages at the same time?
Okay, so the story of Ladino in Israel and Judeo-Arabic is a little bit later. But here there are some you're talking about Free State or about the state?
What? All of the above. I mean, whatever you can tell us in a brief.
For the Free State, it wasn't an issue in Free State. The issue was even Yiddish. You know, there were several attempts to create Yiddish newspapers, and they didn't survive for a long time. The only, as I said, was Naiwelt. Other languages were not strong, and there is another thing, which I have to say, the leaders who came from Eastern Europe didn't appreciate the culture of the Jews who came from other countries. Ben-Zion Dinu, whom I mentioned, in one of the meetings of the Council of the Supreme Council for Culture said, people came here from non-civilized countries, people who didn't saw the emergence of the Gaon. They weren't part of Zionism, or the emergence of Zionism. They were not part of the Jewish labor movement. Whom did he mean? People who are not from Eastern Europe. So they didn't appreciate it so much, and they didn't see it as a threat for the inculcation of Hebrew. They had this East European view that Yiddish, and it was true that Yiddish was the strongest Jewish language. So the rules and the laws were against all non-Hebrew Jewish languages. Foreign languages, real foreign languages, like, let's say, German or Polish, nobody cared too much about. But the Jewish languages were the enemy. And Yiddish was the main enemy. They didn't appreciate these languages so much. They didn't think that people would want to read a newspaper in those languages. So the restrictions were, and they were at the beginning, the early years of the state, there were newspapers in Judeo-Spanish and also in some Judeo-Arabic. There were newspapers. And the government didn't give them much trouble because they didn't think they were a threat.
Similarly, another viewer asked, to the extent that Yiddish had some kind of, that there was a positive feeling for Yiddish despite, the complexity that you've been discussing, did this further create an exclusionary atmosphere for the Mizrahi? I mean, you were speaking a bit to this, but maybe you could speak a bit more to that.
I'm not sure. I think as I see from my research, and there are people who really did research about the attitude to the Mizrahi, it was part of the general attitude, to the Mizrahi Jews. They came from less developed countries, and we had to teach them how to be mentioned. And it wasn't a lingual issue. There is also, I found when I was working on it, I found lots of minutes about meetings, how we will teach these Jews who come from these underdeveloped countries, what is the correct way of life, which is a huge Orientalism. And nowadays, there's a growing interest in it, and people are doing research on it. And it's not, in this aspect, the language is just a minor issue. There are way bigger issues to research. And yes, there was discrimination. Yes, we have to admit it. There was discrimination against people who didn't come from Europe.
Another viewer asks, to what extent did this environment of Yiddish, this kind of complex relationship to Yiddish, affect the Israeli kind of national narrative around the Holocaust?
This is a big one. So it has to be said that in the early 50s there was not such an interest in the Holocaust, and actually, you know, that Holocaust viewer survivors were not so much respected. And I must say that the first newspaper that dedicated a whole page on the day of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is now Yom HaShoah, the day of Holocaust remembers, was, surprise, surprise, Letztenayes, which dedicated a whole page with the writing, also not surprising at all, by Rochel Auerbach. She wrote a whole page in Letztenayes. And Tsanin was actually promoted the memory of Eastern Europe. The Hebrew press was much late, started doing it much, much later. So, and also there is another thing which I couldn't talk about in my 45 minutes, was that Yiddish literature that was written in Israel by young writers. There were established writers who came to Israel, like Leib Rochman, Yeshayahu Spiegel, and Yechiel Hofer, who have already published novels in Poland. But there were some young people who came, who actually first started their career when they came to Israel. They were Holocaust survivors, but they were very young. They were in their 20s. And their prose is very different from the prose written by Israeli-born Hebrew writers. They describe, the experience in Israel as a continuation of the diaspora experience, and also as a kind of redemption from the diaspora, while the Hebrew writers, mainly those who were born or at least raised in Israel, describe that the redemption is forgetting the diaspora. The thread that connects between the diaspora and Israel. The diaspora was flawed, everything was wrong. We are Israelis, strong, tall, tanned in the sun, we are strong, we can do everything, forget about the diaspora. And this is a very, very clear narrative, which is different in the Hebrew Israeli literature and in the prose that was written in Israel by young new immigrants who came from Eastern Europe and wrote in Yiddish.
Fascinating. We have a bunch of questions about the speaking of Yiddish today by Haredi, the Haredi population in Israel. Wondering what is the history of this? How does that play into attitudes towards Yiddish over time and also today?
Okay, so first of all, I must say that in the introduction of my book, I wrote that I'm not dealing with the Haredi community because my interest is in the Yiddish secular culture. The Haredi community is not interested in Yiddish literature, in Yiddish theater, in the secular Yiddish press, and they actually use Yiddish as a way to separate themselves from the Zionist state. They call the state the Zionim. Now, I must say two things here. Let's say in the 60s, it wasn't a great honor to know Yiddish. For example, I understood Yiddish as a child. I didn't speak it, I couldn't read it, but I understood. I didn't tell anyone that I understand Yiddish. It wasn't something to brag about. It was something to keep silent about. Intuitively, nobody said to me, I heard that, the adults in the family, they spoke Hebrew, and you hear it a lot. So when you're a young child, you observe it. Nobody said to me it's not good to speak Yiddish, it's not good to know Yiddish, but it was in the air. And I think that this is a good testimony because the children have good instincts. The other thing, Yiddish was the language of the diaspora. People who spoke Yiddish were galutiyim, exilic, no way to effectively translate it into English, and it wasn't a good thing. And also it was the language of the Haredim, which we don't want to be like them. Now, as far as I know, and there is a specialist, Galit Asulin of the University of Haifa, she specializes in the Yiddish of the Haredim. There are more people, but as far as I know, the use of Yiddish among the Haredim in Israel declines. The Litvak yeshivot don't speak Hebrew, and only the Hasidic courts use Yiddish. They use a lot of Hebrew, and the reason they do it to separate themselves from the secular or from the Zionist state. I'm not sure how it influences the Yiddish, the attitude to Yiddish in Israel now, because the attitude of Yiddish to Yiddish in Israel now is very different from the way it was during the 20th century.
Well, we have so many questions. We don't have time for everything, but maybe that's actually a great place to stop, is with this final question, as what is the attitude towards Yiddish in Israel today? Maybe you could say a brief word about it, from a governmental perspective, but also from a cultural perspective.
Okay. From the governmental, I'll start with the governmental perspective because it's very short. I don't think the government has enough on its plate, and Yiddish is not one of the issues. Yiddish is language of the past. Some people use it, so nobody deals with it. There is the National Authority for Yiddish Culture, which was founded in 1996. It has a budget, and it does some nice activities. It supports some projects in Yiddish, etc. But the general attitude now is more of, oh, it's interesting, it's something special, people appreciate it, people think it was something important that we miss. And so the other thing that was very dominant, and Dan Miron wrote about it, and I also wrote about it a little in my book, but Dan Miron really wrote a lot about it, that Yiddish was treated as something ludicrous, something funny in the bad way. I don't think this attitude still exists. It's more an attitude of respect and of something interesting, something intriguing, something nice. And I must say that the Yiddish Theater in Tel Aviv is very successful, although it has Hebrew and Russian captions. Plays translated from Yiddish into Hebrew, God von Nekomes von Sholem Ash, that was performed in Tel Aviv, have a very good success. So, as time goes by, the attitude used to more respect and appreciation and also curiosity.
Fascinating. Well, Rachel, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this has been wonderful.